The Code of Hammurabi offers us an insight into ancient political philosophy. In this case, the legal system is intertwined with the religious system, as we'll see. This is extraordinarily common. Anything other than a mixture of religion and politics is very, very, very rare in human history and in human cultures. And so the Code of Hammurabi represents our last engagement with polytheistic Babylonian philosophy, which began with the Epic of Gilgamesh, and we'll see finalize soon in monotheistic Babylonian philosophy, with the example of a religious system called Zoroastrianism. Hammurabi's code can be referred to as draconian, meaning excessively harsh. It's a legal system known as the lex talionis, or the law of the talon. And it's well known for its eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth statutes, as well as life for a life. We can use this political and legal system to compare and contrast with our own, and ponder how much our understanding of justice has changed or not changed over the last nearly 4,000 years of the history of civilization. It includes laws against false testimony, which you'll recognize are similar to laws in the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt not commit false testimony against thy neighbor. Notice that in both cases, it's not lying that is illegal, but rather lying in court. Perjury. This is a legal system, as are the Mosaic laws. It includes monetary fines as a form of compensation for legal harms. Perhaps you or someone you know has had to pay a monetary fine through our justice system. Such structures for achieving justice are, as we see, ancient. Could they or should they be changed is a question I leave for you to consider. And we do see a death penalty. And you'll also identify our society too has a death penalty. Capital punishment, or the death penalty, is especially philosophically interesting because of its ethical quandaries, its political dealings, its life or death nature, the epistemology in its application. For example, can we know if someone is guilty or not? And what can we know about how the death penalty is used? And in terms of metaphysics. Metaphysics deals with the ultimate nature of reality. If there is an afterlife, that may indeed support the use of a death penalty. If death is ultimately final. Perhaps that should give us even more pause before we advocate its application. I'm going to skip ahead to the next slide and then return to the things on the previous slide to think through together the ethics and politics of capital punishment, or the death penalty. Those two terms can be used interchangeably. I'm going to include a number of arguments against the death penalty based on my study in ethics. There are a number of texts which have been written regarding the ethics and politics of the death penalty, but for our purposes, I'll summarize some important arguments, but you will notice that I'm largely ignoring any arguments on the other side, namely arguments in favor of the death penalty. My argument is that this is philosophically justified, though I'll try and provide counter-arguments to the arguments that I'm presenting here. Ultimately, though, I think it's more easy and perhaps simplistic to argue in favor of the death penalty, which means that we won't need to apply as much consideration to that side of the argument. Lastly, throughout this course, you will have every reason to question whether I, your professor, has bias or an agenda. That is an appropriate concern to bring to this course, as well as to everything in your life. Every time you read, listen, or speak with someone or a group of people, it's worthwhile to ask, what is the subtext? What is subliminal? What is the subjectivity? What is the bias and agenda? My agenda in this course is to get you to think. And that does involve shaking you up. This is in the style of Socrates. And therefore, what philosophy does get you to question your unexamined presuppositions. For example, a possible unexamined presupposition or uncritical bias that the death penalty is fine. In order to question what is familiar within our socio-cultural context, it will require careful argument. Furthermore, a number of philosophers throughout the history of philosophy have found themselves on one set of sides on certain issues. In terms of religion, Socrates and Nietzsche shake up what people think they know. In terms of nuclear weapons possessed by military nation-states, philosophers like Bertrand Russell and Jean-Paul Sartre have argued forcefully against their proliferation. Very likely no one is bias-free. So allow this to serve as admission, both of my bias and my agenda, so that you can more sufficiently determine for yourself truth from fiction, fact from opinion, reality from illusion, and good arguments from bad arguments. Do not suppose that just because there are two sides to a debate, both sides are equally persuasive. That would require critical investigation. Lastly, you don't know at all if you should trust me in the least. You don't know me. So consider these arguments on their own merits in order to determine what you think is appropriate based on the best logical arguments that can be found. Now, to issues of the death penalty. The first counter-argument I've provided is the idea that two wrongs don't make a right. A simplistic and common wisdom, but perhaps a wisdom nonetheless, that if it's wrong to kill someone, what makes it right for a government to do it? And secondly, that murdering a murderer does not bring back the murdered person. Furthermore, the death penalty probably does not serve the deterrence factor that supposedly it does. Deterrence is the purpose of a punishment to deter or dissuade someone from considering an action to engage in that action. The idea that if I kill my neighbor, then I may be killed in response, depends upon the presumption that people considering murder will behave rationally, which I am arguing we have good reason to reconsider. Likely, people thinking of murdering someone else are not thinking rationally. So, if the deterrence factor depends upon possible murderers thinking rationally, it seems we have a confusion. It's likely too simplistic to argue that if the death penalty were effective, people would not kill other people, because it would actually serve the deterrence factor it's supposed to. Consider also a situation like the Boston Marathon bombing. The two young men who committed this act did not care if they lived or died. And so, what possible deterrence can the death penalty have to someone who doesn't even value their own life, much less the lives of others? You might be tempted to think, on the contrary, if we abolished the death penalty, then there would be no repercussions. Sometimes people say, you could kill someone and get 3 square meals a day a roof over your head and clothes on your back for the rest of your life. Live sitting pretty in prison for decades. I would argue that that argument is naive. I don't think it's realistic to consider the complete and total loss of your freedom in your life and to spend the entirety of your existence locked in a cage, to think that that's a cakewalk or especially pleasant. It is worthwhile for us to be realistic in considerations like this. Third, the death penalty suffers from the problem of epistemological limitations. Epistemology deals with how we know what we know. Can we know for sure that a certain person is accurately the person responsible for the crime? Understand that if we make a mistake, that cannot be undone. The truth of the matter is that our justice system often makes mistakes. And very often these mistakes happen along racial lines. So that there are very relevant questions about who the death penalty is applied to, in terms of race especially, as well as the fallibility of eyewitness testimony. That is, its tendency to be wrong. There are all sorts of subconscious biases. Biases in individual members of society. Biases in members of law enforcement. Biases in lawyers and juries and judges and prison guards. These things contribute to what can be called structural inequalities in our society and justice system. What 20th century and 21st century philosophers have referred to as institutional racism. There are also problems of what's called procedural justice, a type of justice we'll return to towards the end of this semester, involving relative and probably considerable inaccessibility of quality legal representation. Specifically, not everyone who's accused of murder has the benefit of an NFL pro footballer's salary to hire the world's best defense lawyers with. Many people who find themselves accused of murder, rightly or wrongly, likely will be stuck with public defenders who are incredibly overworked and extremely underpaid, considering the life and death difficulties they have to deal with. We could also question if the death penalty is really about revenge, which it may or may not be. Is revenge ethical? If so, then we have no problem. If revenge is inherently unethical, to the extent that the death penalty is nothing more than revenge, it too would be to that extent unethical. When we look comparatively at the United States as opposed to other countries, we see that many other advanced nations such as ourselves, specifically those in Europe, perhaps also Australia, New Zealand, have already abolished the death penalty for these various reasons which I've just identified. And that, in fact, the United States of America ranks very highly in the world in terms of the number of people we use the death penalty against, of which there are significant racial disparities. I'll allow you to investigate, because there is controversy about these claims. So, if other countries have abolished the death penalty, should we or should we not follow suit? But also for context, we should identify that the United States of America is second only to North Korea and China in terms of the percentage of its citizens it executes. Note that North Korea and China are two of the most authoritarian and repressive nations on earth. By those statistical numbers alone, we would have reason to take a second and closer look at our use of the death penalty. At an even broader scale, we would also want to ask, what is the purpose of our justice system? Is it to punish through negative reinforcement? Or is it to rehabilitate? This issue goes beyond the issue of the death penalty narrowly and deals with the justice system as a whole. Many people and philosophers have taken special interest in the justice system in European countries such as Norway, where rehabilitation is the primary concern of the justice system, and compared that with the United States, where rehabilitation has grown some small amount in terms of its consideration within our justice system, but largely our justice system is motivated by the desire for punishment, if not revenge. This realm of concern goes far deeper than we can hope to deal with here. And so I leave you to wrestle with those competing motivations. While our society, again, largely motivated by Abrahamic religion, doesn't seem to have any issue with punishment as an appropriate means of achieving justice. As we'll discuss later in the semester, it is only one of many set of ideas with which we can think through issues of justice. And the question of justice is one of the most philosophically important discussions that we'll have to deal with. In terms of rounding out our discussion of the death penalty, we could also question how to prevent murders from occurring in the first place. One example of that would perhaps be to deal with things like structural poverty in our society. For example, imagine two parallel universes. In one, there's a wealthy person with sufficient mental and physical health care. He has enough to meet his needs. He's not in danger of starving or living on the streets. And imagine someone wrongs him significantly. For that person, we might imagine they take a week off of work, fly to the Riviera in France, sip a Mai Tai, and forget all their problems. Take in the second parallel universe a person who works 40 to 80 hours a week and yet remains in poverty no matter how hard he tries. A person without health care, a person without a social safety net, a person whose life is one of unrelenting stress, physical, emotional, social, psychological, with no mental help, no mental health care help. And no social safety net, which means that if he loses his job, or if there's an unexpected occurrence, he could wind up evicted, out in the streets, hungry, begging. For the second person, living life at the end of their rope, if somebody wrongs that person, it seems to make much more sense that a person in that situation would be more likely to snap. So that our issues of homicide, for example, which the death penalty is supposed to deal with after the fact, we could, if we so desired or so chose, deal in terms of prevention instead of retribution. Now, it might also be the case that a rich man thinks he can get away with murder. And certainly rich people do commit crimes too. But it would be worthwhile to investigate the influence of such economic and social factors on things like the homicide rate, if we desire to deal realistically in terms of reality. Some people argue that it's cheaper to simply kill people who are convicted of something like murder rather than keep them alive in prison for the rest of their lives, giving them a free ride. Because of the cost of the appeals process and lawyers, many have made the argument that it's actually more expensive to apply the death penalty rather than to keep someone in prison for life. However, this is really just a function of the expensiveness of lawyers. At the broadest and perhaps most abstract philosophical levels, we could ask the sorts of questions about nature versus nurture and free will. There's a bias that says we really do have free will, but there's a long history of philosophical questioning regarding whether or not it really exists. If people's behaviors really are determined by their genetics, their upbringing, or their environment, how would that affect the ethics of applying the death penalty? If indeed people are not so easily blamed as we might uncritically believe. Lastly, it's worthwhile to question whether there's any room for mercy or forgiveness in our justice system. What's especially relevant in terms of our class and our society for these questions is that when we look to a important spiritual figure such as Jesus, we see that his philosophy is one contrary to an eye for an eye. Specifically, Jesus is offering something different than the lex talionis, which the Code of Hammurabi and its death penalty provides. It's certainly appropriate for us to ask, should there be any religiousness in our justice system? We could easily argue yes or no to that. But I'll leave off the discussion with the following question. Does murdering a murderer help us heal? Or does forgiving and doing better to those than they do to us what helps us heal and makes us civilized? I'll return now to the Code of Hammurabi briefly and finish off as quickly as I can. We also see in the Code of Hammurabi laws for slavery, a political conundrum and ethical morass our society wrestled with until merely 150 years ago. Hammurabi speaks of himself as a salvation-bearing shepherd, which has considerable similarity to how Jesus speaks of himself. Both Hammurabi and Jesus considered to be god kings. And also a couple of new deities and Babylonian deities we had not seen previously in the Epic of Gilgamesh. This is important as it represents that Babylonian polytheism has been evolving over time. Cultures, societies, ethics, and religions very often seem to evolve. Though the implications of that, especially for our own culture and spirituality systems, might be unexpected. Lastly, Hammurabi ends his legal code with a threat and a curse that anyone who changes it be cursed to various plagues and disasters. This is a theme which also has similarities in the New Testament Christian book of Revelation, which ends with similar threats and curses. Let anyone who changes this text be doomed and cursed as well.